80% of all of our white blood cells, our immune system, live on inside the gut wall because mischief can come through.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Food Matters podcast, your home for nutrition, health, and wellness education. My name is Laurentine. I am a filmmaker and a nutritionist and the founder of foodmatters.com, and I'm here to hold your hand on this journey to optimum health, transformation, and emotional healing. Hello, Food Matters family. How is everyone doing? I am so excited. I am here today in the podcast studio with a gentleman called Dr. Stephen Gundry. And Dr. Stephen Gundry is actually a very famous author, but he's also a researcher. And he's a renowned surgeon, gut health expert, and 4-time New York Times bestselling author. As the founder of the Gundry DM and host of the Dr. Gundry podcast, he has dedicated his career to uncovering the link between diet, the microbiome, and disease prevention. His latest book, The Gut-Brain Paradox, explores how gut health directly impacts brain function, mood, and longevity. Welcome, Doctor. Thank you so much for coming on here and talking about longevity.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, actually, this is the second time we recorded because the last time Dr. Gundry was in a storm, right? And it got cut off.
Yeah, we lost all our power and everything, and that was the end of that. But here I am. We're back again.
Here we are talking about longevity and gut health. Now, for a lot of people that talk about the gut-brain function, it's still a little bit quasi-complicated. So could we, in layman's terms, try to understand what we mean when we talk about the gut-brain functionality?
Well, so if we went back a number of years, we really thought that the brain existed to tell the gut what to do. And there was a large nerve called the vagus nerve that we were convinced ran from the brain down to the various organs and kind of regulated the organs. And we believed that for many years. When neurons were discovered in the gut, and it was discovered that there were as many nerve cells in the gut as there was in the spinal cord, people began to wonder, well, maybe those guys are doing something rather than just receiving information from the brain. Mm-hmm. Then fast forward to the Human Microbiome Project, which was completed in just 2017. And we realized that there were 100 trillion bacteria that lived in our gut, that there were 1,000 different species of bacteria in our mouth, that there were 700 different species of bacteria on our skin. We began to think that, well, maybe those guys might be talking to the brain. And when it was discovered that if you look at the vagus nerve, for every one fiber that comes from the brain down to the gut, there's actually 9 fibers going from the gut up to the brain. So rather than the brain telling the gut what to do, it became more and more clear that it was actually the gut and its inhabitants that were telling the brain what to do. And it's just gone on from that point where we've discovered the entire language that exists, how bacteria talk to our various cells. And I talked about that in the energy paradox and Gut Check, my last book. And this book, The Gut-Brain Paradox, expands on that to try to make a very powerful case that most of our thought processes, most of mood, most of personality is controlled by the mixture of gut microbiome. Goes beyond that. Most of our food choices are dictated by the type of bacteria that are living in our gut. And most of our addictive behaviors are actually dictated by the bacteria that live in our gut and the types of bacteria. Now, that sounds pretty depressive, but actually, it's really good news because now that we know that this communication system exists, we can modulate who lives down there. We can feed good guys what we now know they like to eat, and we can pretty much starve the bad guys of the things we know they want to eat. And it's actually really exciting that we know this much about those guys now.
Wow. I think this is personally a really important topic, and I think it's not really explored enough. But the mental health issues that are connected to the brain gut function. So, when we have really poor gut bacteria, or we have a really poor functioning gut brain bacteria system and some
Yeah,
ecosystem, we
yeah,
can actually also see that in those patients that are also experiencing different types of mental health issues, from schizophrenia, bipolar, even autism. Could you enlighten us about that a little bit more through your research?
yeah. You're exactly right. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, 2,500 years ago, said all disease begins in the gut. And the guy was right. How he knew this, I've been spending 30 years trying to figure out how he knew it. He certainly was right. But we now can isolate certain sets of bacteria that associate with depression. We can isolate certain sets of bacteria that associate with Alzheimer's. We can associate bacteria with Parkinson's, and so on. We know that we can manipulate autism both intrautero and also after birth by changing the microbiome. And I go into a lot of detail about that. One of the most things that makes it almost believable, because all this seems incredibly hard to believe. I mentioned the vagus nerve. Back in the dark ages, to be a heart surgeon in the United States, you had to be trained as a general surgeon first. And general surgeons obviously operated on the belly. Believe it or not, general surgeons were the first gastroenterologists. We did all the scopes and things like that. Anyhow, to treat ulcer disease, we used to cut the vagus nerve because we incorrectly believed that the vagus nerve was the acid was the cause of ulcers, and vagus nerve controlled acid production in the
Are
stomach.
you serious? That was a
Oh,
practice? You guys used to do that stuff?
oh yeah, all the time, routinely,
What, to
several
young
times.
kids, to older people, everybody got the snip when there was an issue there?
Yeah, there were no acid reducing drugs. There wasn't any Prilosec or anyhow, and so that was standard of care.
Right.
When we realized that we only had to snip the fibers of the vagus nerve that went to the stomach to get the same result, these were called selective vagotomies. Well, so what? Well, a lot of people had these operations in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and they've been followed for many years. And what was striking after a number of years was that people who had their vagus nerve cut had a 50% less chance of having Parkinson's disease than people who had a vagus nerve that hadn't been cut. 50%,
Okay.
really, a 50% reduction.
Right.
So then you go, well, what about those people who just had the vagus nerve snipped to the stomach and the rest of it was intact? That had no impact on Parkinson's. So the light bulb went off in a lot of researchers, including me, saying, whoa, wait a minute. The problem is coming, Parkinson's, the problem is coming from the gut. It's not the brain initially.
Wow.
And so then people began to look at, well, what the heck is coming from the gut? And interestingly enough, with leaky gut, you can get plant particles like lectins, which made me infamous or famous, that can actually climb the vagus nerve and get to the part of the brain called the substantia nigra that controls movement. And lo and behold, all of this kind of Pandora's box opened up, and we realized that, it's not the brain that's causing Parkinson's, it's things that are coming from the gut that are actually causing. And it's the same with Alzheimer's. What's Everybody in Alzheimer's, I hope, knows that we've spent, I think it's $20 billion in research looking at the amyloid plaque and the tau protein cause of Alzheimer's. And drug research was aimed at dissolving these amyloid plaques or breaking up the tau protein. And every one of these have been a dismal failure. So, and the famous nun study showed that there were a large number of nuns who were perfectly normal intellectually that had all these amyloid plaques and tau proteins in their brain, and they seemed to function fine. So when we began understanding that leaky gut is a real thing, intestinal permeability is the fancy name for it. It's not pseudoscience. We can measure it, we can measure the degree of it. We realize that the wall of our gut has got a design flaw. When all of us are watching the Indian Wells BNP Paribas tennis tournament that started today, we should realize that the lining of our gut is the same surface area as one or two tennis courts.
Wow, that's huge.
It's huge. It's huge. And we have a design flaw in that the lining is only one cell thick. That's it. So
Right. So it can be very
everything
permeable.
it's very permeable. Now, because it's so permeable, 80% of all of our white blood cells, our immune system, live on inside the gut wall because mischief can come through. And that can include bacteria, bacterial particles, lectins, foods, and our immune system. If that happens, and I assure you it happens all the time, the immune system fights locally, and that's where inflammation comes from. But the immune system sends out warning sirens that says, "Oh my gosh, we're under attack down here in the gut."
Right.
And it sends information, text messages to the immune system of the brain that are called glial cells.
Wait,
White
so
blood.
what do those text messages look like if we're talking about symptoms?
Well, those text messages aren't symptoms, but we've now been able to identify those text messages. They're cytokines. And it basically says, "Oh my gosh, the hordes are coming across the border. They're here. We know they're heading up there, and protect yourself at all costs."
Right.
One of the examples that I think resonates with people because of 9/11, after 9/11, the terror of terrorists around the world, we started putting barriers in front of important buildings. Most of the government buildings began to get concrete barriers or obstructions so that some terrorist couldn't ram a car through. And as I try to have my patients visualize, these amyloid plaques and these tau proteins are merely barriers that the immune system throws up in our brain to protect these vital structures, the neurons. So if we think of it like that, it's not the tau proteins and the amyloid plaque that's the trouble. It's the fact that we have leaky gut and messages are being sent up to put all these barriers in place because they're coming up. And what's exciting in my work and my patients, and certainly in Dr. Dale Bredesen's work, who's become a really good friend of mine, we know that treating the gut is the way to treat the brain. Completely backwards of how we view it.
Completely backwards. I love this. This is so interesting. Okay, but so let's go to real practical things for people that want to know. So, in regards to the microbiome, what can we do to upset this microbiome to make sure that we get leaky gut? Let's talk about the mistakes that we make.
Well, and I've written about this in all my books. The Plant Paradox was the monster books 8 years ago. But all of our practices, the use of antibiotics is a really great way to kill off our microbiome. I was in medical school in the 70s when broad spectrum antibiotics were introduced, and we thought they were miraculous.
Oh, yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
because, before we had to culture a bacteria, we had to wait for it to grow. If we were lucky enough, then we had to test against antibiotics, and that it just, but with broad spectrum antibiotics, now we had a shotgun and we
And
could
then
just
boom, it's done.
blast everything. And it was miraculous. Little did we know that we were also killing off the entire microbiome. We just didn't know. Then it was about the same time it was discovered that if you gave animals broad spectrum antibiotics, they would grow faster and fatter. And so, up until really a very few years ago, all animals were fed antibiotics,
Yeah.
and
So
all of
when
our
we eat those animals, we're also getting a double dose.
that's exactly right. So we have done a really good job of killing off our microbiome. Now, why that's important for two reasons. Number one, our microbiome, if it's in good shape, is really the main defense against everything we eat. They're really good at taking care of most mischief that we eat. For instance, we know that super old people have a microbiome that can even eat microplastics. They think it's delicious. There's a microbiome that can eat oxalates. There's a microbiome that can eat gluten. But most of those guys have
Mm.
all been wiped out. So, in a way, it's no wonder that we're kind of a sitting duck. The other thing we've learned is that the microbiome is critical for teaching our immune system, our white blood cells, who they need to be worried about, who's okay, don't worry so much.
The
How,
Homeland Security.
yeah. So, I trained in London for a while back in the 80s in children's heart surgery. And at that time, bobbies didn't have guns, they just had a nightstick. And that's all they had. And now, of course, everybody's in Kevlar vests and they've got an AK-47 and they've got their finger on the trigger walking
Wow.
down the street. Why? Because now our immune system hasn't been told to relax. It's there's a terrorist around every corner.
Yeah.
And so we've got to be on the ready. And that's really one of the main drivers of all this inflammation.
And if
So,
yes, go back.
so number one, we've got to reconstitute our, what I talk about in the book, our terrain, our tropical rainforest. And it's hard to do, but it can be done. Number two, one of the things that's striking, about 80% of my patient population is autoimmune diseases who really aren't getting better or they want to get off these immunosuppressive drugs. And all of these people, number one, have leaky gut, 100% of them. And all of them, when they walk through the door, usually have a low vitamin D level. And it's critical to understand that vitamin D is essential to help repair the wall of the gut when it gets damaged. And studies that I talk about in the gut brain paradox, the higher your level of vitamin D, the more diverse your microbiome is, the better your tropical rainforest is.
Mm.
So it's kind of a 1-2 punch. Get your vitamin D levels up. Now, you guys are taught to be afraid of the sunshine, which is probably one of the worst things that you could ever
Slap on the sunscreen, right?
slap on the sunscreen, which is loaded with endocrine disruptors, by the way. And we're so afraid of the sun. And people in Southern California, 80% of people in Southern California are vitamin D deficient. In Southern California, it's
It's
like,
so hard to imagine.
yeah, it's like, well, why? Because we're
Because we're
weather
putting on so much sunscreen that, I mean, they put it in pretty much every makeup or
everybody,
any cream you put on. So we're really
and every,
protecting
and everybody,
ourselves.
and everybody's told to wear long sleeve shirts when they go out in the sun,
Right.
put caps. Anyhow, so we just do not get enough vitamin D. Strong recommendations that I back from the University of California, San Diego, which is a big vitamin D research unit in the United States. They think the average American should be taking 10,000 international units of vitamin D3 a day. That's 250 micrograms in the metric system,
Or the sunshine equivalent.
or the sunshine equivalent. But even with sunshine, once you get a tan, you stop absorbing vitamin D.
That's so hard to imagine. Like if we would be out in the jungle and living in traditional ways, I guess we would be able to get the sun. But if it's blocking us because of our the
Well,
melatonin, the
well,
melanin. Oh, right. Right. So then we need to supplement. And the best amount, did you say? Let's repeat that so that we can get the right amounts.
most people need 250 micrograms or 10,000 international units of vitamin D3 a day. It's a lot. Now, I like to supplement that with vitamin K2, and you really only need about 100 micrograms of vitamin K2.
Right.
So,
Going back to some of the symptoms where we can tell that our microbiome is in distress, could you talk about, like what you said, you have a lot of patients that walk in and you can tell that they have a leaky gut, IBS, all those. What type of symptoms do you generally see in those patients? Do you feel overwhelmed by all the conflicting health and nutrition advice out there? Are you tired of spending time and money on specialist appointments only to leave you with more questions than answers? Well, you're not alone. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you value your health and want to take the best care of yourself and your loved ones. At Food Matters, we believe your body is worthy of good care, and no one is more qualified to care for it more than you are. That's why we created the Food Matters Nutrition Certification course, a world-class program designed to help you cut through the confusion and transform your health with trusted science-backed nutrition knowledge. In just 12 weeks, you'll gain the tools to heal yourself and others, learning from some of the greatest minds in nutrition, including Dr. Bruce Lipton, Dr. Libby Weaver, Krista Orecchio, and more. And as a special thank you for Food Matters podcast listeners, you're offered 20% off enrollment, automatically applied when you use the link in your show notes. So head to foodmatters.com/study.
well, in the plant paradox, I put 3 pages of symptoms that range from headaches, migraines, sore joints, eczema, any skin rash, heart disease, diabetes, you name it, it's caused by leaky gut. And bloating,
Stomach
diarrhea,
cramps,
constipation.
yeah,
Uh,
constipation, extreme diarrhea.
yeah,
Yeah, there's,
so many.
yeah,
It's funny. I was talking to a young lady just this past week who works for a dermatologist next to me and in Santa Barbara in my other office. And we were talking about a totally different subject. And she says, so, what do you do? I see you around here. I said, well, I treat primarily autoimmune diseases. And she says, oh, I have Hashimoto's and it's just tearing up my gut. And I'm going, no, your gut being torn up is causing your Hashimoto's. And all these practitioners that she's seeing have, well, we got to, calm down your thyroid. We got to do all these, you got to eat anti-inflammatory foods. And living in California with all of our forest fires, trying to fight a forest fire with a garden hose is like trying to fight Hashimoto's with anti-inflammatory foods. So then she actually just started crying. She said, "Oh," she said, "it makes no wonder my tummy hurts. It's not my thyroid; it's the other way around." I said, "Yeah." So we're going to start working with her. But that's a good example.
So, what would you then instead recommend, and how would you treat these type of Hashimoto and different types of autoimmune conditions?
Well, so what we have to do, we now know that not only do you need the proper amount of probiotics, and we're getting better and better every year at recognize who the important guys are. Number two, you got to give these probiotics food that they want to eat. And that in general is soluble fiber. A very famous English surgeon, Dennis Burkitt, was a colorectal surgeon a few years ago in the 50s. And he went on a mission work to Africa and he wanted to go, do, do colon surgery and hemorrhoid surgery. And he got down there, thought he'd be very busy and help everybody. No, and nobody had any issues. There wasn't any colon cancer. There wasn't any diverticulitis. There weren't any hemorrhoids. And he's going, well, what the heck?
What am I doing here?
What am I doing here? But more importantly, why don't these people have
Exactly.
our problems? So he started following these guys. And it's really a funny story. He began following these Africans out to the bush where they took a crap. And their bowel movements were jokingly the size of termite mounds. They were huge. And then he said, well, what are these guys eating? Well, these guys are eating huge amounts of tubers, sweet potatoes
Roots,
and the
sweet
roots.
potatoes, yams.
And that was their food. And he said, my gosh, it's all this fiber that they're eating
Right.
that's preventing them from having the issues that I take as normal in England. So he came back to England and he said, well, fiber is fiber. And England has plenty of fiber in wheat, and wheat has insoluble fiber. Doesn't have much of any soluble fiber, but fiber is fiber. So he was actually the father of the high fiber diet, but it was completely the wrong form of fiber. And it literally was like swallowing razor blades. Yeah. So he was right, but he was really wrong. And it was the soluble fiber, the resistant starches that the Africans were eating. Now, why did they have such giant bowel movements? We used to think that whatever we crapped out was just kind of leftover stuff
What
that
our
we,
body doesn't need.
yeah, it was junk. Most of our bowel movements are actually composed of dead and living bacteria, not junk. And what was happening with these Africans was they were giving their bacteria, the good guys, all this probiotic fiber. And they were making lots and lots of other, little baby bacteria. And so what he was seeing was these guys were happy. And there they were making more and more bacteria. And that's a good friend of mine is Dr. Terry Walls, who cured herself of MS by eating 9 cups of vegetables a day. And she actually, in her office, has stuffed bowel movement little figurines with eyes on them. And she and I both think that after you have a bowel movement on the toilet, you should look in the bowl and see a coiled snake looking back at you, and you'll be fine. In fact, I'm going to get out of the way. I think you can probably see that.
The road to good health is paved with good intestines. That is
That's
so true. A
that.
lot of us don't actually know what is inside this part of our body. Like we just don't have a way to look inside of us, and we've not really studied enough, or it's not really taught in schools to
No,
know what really goes on. We know that yes, there is an intestine in there somewhere, but we don't really know what to do about, if a
but
food
what that,
tastes good, well, then just eat it. That's what a lot of people would believe. However, if we really start to eat for our microbiome, we'd be eating a lot differently.
yeah, there's very famous, the godfather of fitness in the United States, who I got to know in his later years, was a guy by the name of Jack LaLanne. And Jack LaLanne lived into his mid 90s. And Jack had an expression that my advisors tell me never to say, but he says, if it tastes good, spit it out. Now, what he was trying to say is exactly what you're trying to say. We shouldn't be motivated by this 2 by 3 inch piece of muscle.
No.
We should be motivated by feeding our gut microbiome what they need because we're actually their home. And if
Mm.
we, the point of all these books is if we take care of them, they will take care of us. And what's really interesting about these super old people is they have this just amazing, diverse, dense microbiome with all these different species. And they have a really intact wall of their gut. In fact, to paraphrase Hippocrates, death begins in the gut. And as the wall of our gut breaks down, and as this leaky gut gets worse, that's when we begin to see everything kind of go downhill.
Going pear shaped. So tell us a little bit more. I used to live in Vanuatu, in the tropical islands of Vanuatu. And a lot of times with the local farmers there, if you go to fruit and vegetable markets, they would sell their produce, and it's organic, permaculture rich ground. So they would sell their produce with all the soil still intact. So you never really saw anybody washing that soil too much. It was very much like, you didn't have that much water or running water around there. So they would just throw the vegetables in unwashed, but that would be forming the microbiome that actually goes in from the soil, goes into the gut. And because it's organic and it's permaculture, that was actually helping to give them a very healthy gut microbiome. And you didn't see any incidences there of the IBS and the any type of colon cancer that we see here in the West.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. When I grew up in the 50s and 60s and after World War II, and in the United States during World War II, everybody planted a victory garden. And in fact, in the United States, 42% of all the food consumed during World War II in the United States was grown in victory gardens, backyard victory gardens. So,
Yes.
and if anybody bothers to look, the incidence of heart disease and diabetes in the United States, in England, plummeted during the war years when everybody, because there was sugar rationing, there was flour rationing, and everybody had, a home garden. And it plummeted. And then, of course, when the war was over, started right back up.
Everybody went to what's microwaves? Okay, let's do it. Let's just do packaged foods because it's more
Yeah.
convenient.
Right. And
That's
then
very true. That's where it
yeah,
all started again.
it's all, yeah, you can just watch it. It just plummeted and then
Wow.
right on up. And you're right. The thing about hunter gatherers is all of their food was, in 8 feet of loam soil. And you're right. Nobody washed these things coming out of the ground. And I talk a lot about it in the new book that the roots have their own microbiome, their own soil microbiome. And that soil microbiome is actually incredibly important, not only because of the bugs, but those bugs teach our immune system not to be worried about some of these types of bacteria because we're eating them all the time. And your microbiome says, hey guys, these guys are here all the time. They're fine. Just don't get upset. Now, if a bad bug comes in, everybody, now we've got a machine gun ready to kill these guys. And as you know, and unfortunately we know in the West, we've killed our soil with, petrochemicals and particularly in the United States, Roundup and glyphosate. And luckily, there are a few places in the world that are resisting using Roundup, but it gets worse
Yes.
every year. And Roundup, I think we talked before, most people don't know that Monsanto, which is now owned by Bayer, patented Roundup as an antibiotic. It wasn't patented as a weed killer.
Wow.
Yeah.
There you
So
go. Anyway, moral of the story, I feel like people need to realize that yes, if we buy more from our fruit and vegetable markets that comes directly from our organic farmers or our sustainable farmers, and we don't necessarily be so fastidious about having to wash everything like they do at Coles and Woolies here, which I feel like they're washing it in chlorine or bleach or something to get rid of all the bacteria. But let's be less fastidious about cleaning it and knowing that those, I guess, those pathogens or those germs or those good bacteria are adding to our microbiome.
that's right. They're adding to the education of our immune system.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, when we had a victory garden, we'd pull carrot out of the ground and we didn't go into the, brush it on our pants and eat it. And, we didn't go into the house and scrub it, or we didn't carry around a disinfectant, spray it. Yeah, we were always doing that. And we've just lost that.
And going back to, I love this topic, mental health issues and the foods that we eat. So there was an incredible study that was done in the Monash University by a doctor named Professor Ian Brighthope. And Dr. Ian Brighthope wanted to test out how food and nutrition would work for patients that have been put into a mental asylum. And these were young students. They were not actually even, they were juveniles still. And they were put into a mental asylum ready to go actually to the electric chair. And he said, you know what, I want to do a couple of experiments nutritionally first before we have them move on to the next level. And he had them sit down and did the microbiome test. He looked at their nutritional levels and deficiencies, and he also looked at their stool quality. And what he found is that there was a certain, especially in these young children that were just young kids, really displaying horrible violence and behavioral issues, that he was finding that they were actually allergic to yeast. They were dairy intolerant, and they had a very low vitamin B and vitamin D function. So there we go. And if you had, and he had a lot of time on his hands, but luckily he was able to reverse this, and he actually took them off. They were having breakfast consisting of bread, this Australian paste which we call Vegemite. I don't know if you
Vegemite, yeah.
Vegemite. So they were having white bread and Vegemite and milk for breakfast. And all those foods were removed, and their gut bacteria helped to repopulate, and they were introducing more vegetables and more fruits. And they were put on a certain type of nutrient program that helped to balance out their deficiencies. And guess what? 3 months later, they were functioning human beings, very happy to continue to abide by rules and happy to work back into the system. And so what we saw, especially with these type of researchers, is that we can actually, when we repair the microbiome, we can actually fix mood and behavioral issues. That to me is huge.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And as I talk about in the gut brain paradox, we know that there are actually certain bacteria that correlate with personality type. That you can be a warm, embracing human being because you have certain bacteria that make you that way. And as you note, there are other bacteria or fungi or mold that'll make you a very aggressive human being. And I call it maybe the McDonald's diet for aggressive behavior. And yeah, then there was actually a study very similar in a town in Wisconsin, in northern United States, called Appleton, Wisconsin. And they had a middle school who they had behavior issues. There was truancy and acting out. And so there was an organic cafe in town. And they partnered with the organic cafe to supply breakfast and lunch for the students. And then the chefs from this organic cafe would give classes to the parents on kind of how to keep doing this at dinner time. And they did this for about 6 months. And the school test scores skyrocketed, truancy rate fell,
Plummeted.
and the trips to the principal's office, for bad behavior, just, plummeted. And they were so excited. And the cafe said, well, this has been great, but we're really busy and we'd like to help, but,
We don't have the time.
we don't have the time. So they said, well, we know what to do now. And what we'll do is we'll get one of the big food service companies to reproduce this. We'll bring them in. They brought in, and I won't mention the company, and it plummeted right back the way it was.
Crashed.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Even just by realizing that we went from a more home organic style cooking to a more processed and more fast, efficient processing food system, that also didn't work.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Wow.
So, so you're right. The good news is, for instance, and I talk about this in the book, you can do really interesting animal studies where you can take rats. By the way, rats love to eat poop. It's part of their thing. And you can give them bowel movements from depressed human beings, and they'll get depressed. Oh, yeah, they just will not care about anything. And then you can take rats and give them bowel movements to eat from happy individuals. And the rats, that you can actually measure happiness in a rat. Yeah,
We need to be careful who we hang out with, right?
I'm glad you mentioned that because we
I'm
know
not saying we are eating people's feces, but the microbiome is on lots of different things from
exactly right.
anything.
For
You
instance,
know what I'm talking about.
there's an obesity microbiome and that you can catch that microbiome. We know that people who hang out with obese people eventually become obese themselves.
Wow.
There's also a lean microbiome, and you can catch a lean microbiome. And it sounds kind of voodoo and voodoo, but we share microbiome in the air. And
I love that.
I'm a huge fan of people getting a dog or an outside cat because dogs are incredibly useful for bringing a different microbiome, a soil microbiome, to us. And we know that people who have dogs or outside cats have a much more diverse microbiome than people who don't have dogs or an inside cat. So, and let your dog lick your face. It's doing you a favor.
Well, I was researching some of the ancient Greek ways that they used to treat patients, and in the Greek hospitals, it was a lot of dog licking and even snakes. They would use them as part of their healing process. Now we're going back millennia here, but that is interesting, right? That the microbiome on a dog was helping to heal wounds from their mouth.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for those that are wishing to heal their gut issues, let's go over again the certain foods we've spoken about vitamin D and keeping those levels in check. What other foods? We spoke about fibers, and we spoke about foods that have tubers and roots that have good for the digestive system. What other things that we can do today?
The chicory family of vegetables are incredibly useful. So radicchio, chicory, Belgian endive, frisee. There's a Italian chicory called puntarella. I'm not sure if it's available in Australia, but so anytime you can eat chicory. Asparagus is very useful. Artichoke hearts are very useful. And again, the tuber, any root vegetable, radishes are great. So the other beetroot. The other thing that's really important for people to realize is I can get you to heal a leaky gut. But if you keep swallowing what I call razor blades, you'll slice it right back open. And those in general are the grains, particularly the whole grains: corn, rye, barley, oats. There are two safe grains, millet and sorghum. They don't have any lectins. The nightshade family are notorious for causing leaky gut. White potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, even berries are a problem. So trying to keep those out of our diet, or peeling and de-seeding tomatoes is also very useful. Those are tricks. Okay?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gundry, for this beautiful discussion on gut health, microbiome, and how we can heal our autoimmune conditions. It's been super informative, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your research. And we really hope to see more information come to light. So, on this topic, keep writing and doing your best to get this information to more people. We love what you do, and thank you so much for talking about it with us today. So, yes, thank you everyone for listening. I really enjoyed that talk. I hope you did too. And there will be more of these on the Food Matters podcast. So, head to foodmatters.com. And see you again.